Hi everyone, welcome to Punk Women, Memoirs and Biographies. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, a dynamic and engaging programme of talks, events and activities. The festival is being produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts and Humanities at Sussex University. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the Festival of Ideas website after the festival. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. A member of the festival's team may contact attendees for feedback afterwards. If you do not wish to be contacted, please email the festival team to opt out of communications. You can find the details on the festival's website. We welcome your questions via the Q&A panel, which you will also find on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and we will respond to these questions if time permits. Just a note, this event will finish promptly at 2:15 p.m. And now I'll hand over to Professor Lucy Robinson.
Oh, thanks, Emma. Thanks so much for your help. So Punk Women, Memoirs and Biographies is the final in a series of events or maybe occupations in the MAR Festival. And we're sort of supported by Vivienne Westwood's Intellectuals Unite, the Subcultures Network and the Museum of Youth Culture. And in this is more of a conversation than a panel, I think. And in this conversation, I want to think about how punk women have and can write themselves into punk history. And on the way, I think there's two things that I'm going to focus on in my part of the conversation, but please do use the Q&A to add your own questions, which we'll get to at the end. The first thing I think is I want to think about punk women and sisterhood and motherhood and how punk women do or don't get remembered. One of the things that I regularly come up with in my work is that we are writing women back into history who have been written into history before. So how do we get women to stick in history? And if we think about punk as a community or an effective network, if we think about punk as being about connections and ways of living, then I think that there might be things that punk can teach us about being women, about living together, and about getting on with each other. So one is kind of thinking about history and punk and what that means more broadly. And then the second thing that I want to think about is how we can write individual women into punk history. Why it seems that that's a never finished project. What individual women can we write into history and how do we do that? And we're going to be doing that with some practicalities and processes, really. So thinking about how Zoe and Celeste have worked together. So I'm delighted to introduce our contributors. So firstly, we have Zoe Howe, who's written acclaimed biographies of artists, including Poly Styrene, so that's Dayglo, which is co-authored with Celeste, Belle, as well as The Slits, Jesus and Mary Chain, Wilko Johnson, Stevie Nicks, Lee Brillo. Zoe was also part of the team behind the documentary Poly Styrene, I'm a Cliche. And one of the things that I think will be really interesting for us to think about is the relationship between a biography and a memoir and also an exhibition. So think about different forms. A visual artist and sometime musician, she's worked with Viv Albertine and Helen McCookery Book, Steve Beresford and others. And Zoe also presents the Rock and Roll Witch Show on Soho Radio. And then alongside Zoe, we've got Celeste. Celeste Belle spent her early years living on a Hare Krishna commune in Hertfordshire countryside with her mother, Poly Styrene. After completing her degree from Queen Mary University in London, finishing a master's degree in Barcelona, Celeste returned to London to work alongside Zoe on Dayglo, the Poly Styrene story, which we're going to be thinking about, published by Omnibus Press in 2019. And they then joined forces with Paul Singh to make Poly Styrene, I'm a Cliche, a film that accompanies the book. And that would be interesting to think about, I think. Celeste currently manages her mother's artistic estate, co-curating an exhibition alongside Matty Loyce at the 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning Centre in Brixton, and plans to tour the exhibition internationally after the pandemic. And is currently working on a project with the working title, Mr. Gorbachev and the Krishna Kids, which sounds really interesting. So just a little bit of context before I open up the conversation, thinking about women and punk history. Caroline Kuhn, the journalist who is credited with coming up with the word punk, once suggested that you could write a whole history of punk only talking about women. And there's a quote from Chrissie Hynde in one of the Women in Rock books. It's in the introduction to it. And I really remember reading it in a bookstore shop, actually, not even owning the book, where she says, hang on, if women in rock are so forgotten, why am I asked to do interviews about being a woman in rock every day? And I think that really raises the question, what's the relationship between women's experiences in punk then and how women in punk have been remembered since. And what is it that we could do that could make women stick in the history of punk? Layer on top of that, people of colour and the layers of forgetting and unsticking in the history is built up and up and up. So I want to think a little bit about the role of key individuals and what we can do with their stories. It feels as though we are in a moment, or for a few years, we've been in a moment of re-noticing women in punk. And I think there's been a particularly important role of biography and memoir and documentary in rewriting that history. So alongside Celeste and Zoe's book, there's a series of successful memoirs that have really opened up the conversation, whether that's from sort of the broader understanding of punk, so maybe thinking about Tracy Thorn or Kathleen Hanna, or Viv Albertine and Jordan Mooney, and the number of documentary projects, including Stories from She Punks, which was included in the British Library Anniversary exhibition, where Viv Albertine famously had to add the slits in sharpie to the catalogue of punk bands. But I'd like to start off by thinking about punk and motherhood, which might seem like a bit of an anathema, or punk in the family. I think families are often largely absent from subcultural histories. They tend to be histories that focus on the street. So I wondered if either of you really had any thoughts about how punk or being punk might work as a way of thinking about families. One of the things that struck me is that when we write our own memoirs, we're always to some extent actually writing about our mother's biographies, even if we're writing about their absences. Or when we write the biography of women, we're always to some extent thinking about their upbringing. So I wondered if either of you had anything to think about, kind of what might thinking about punk bring to our understanding of how families work? What does a punk family look like? Or how does punk motherhood work? So either of you have got any thoughts on that?
I think that sounds like a question for Celeste. I mean, punk motherhood is, I never thought of my mother in that sense. And I don't think we had anything resembling what a punk family might look like. We were very much post-punk, a post-punk family. My mum had left that life behind her. So by the time I was born, and she was deeply entrenched in the Hare Krishna movement, which definitely superseded anything to do with punk. But, you know, maybe joining the Hare Krishnas was a pretty punk thing to do at the time. And I certainly had an unconventional childhood. So if that's what we mean by punk, if there's some connection between unconventionality and, don't even know if that's a word, if I've just invented that word, but certainly an unconventional family in every sense of the word. What that has to do with punk, I'm not sure, but that's what we're here to talk about.
It is, and but I think there's something there, isn't there, about being unconventional, but also I guess the other things we think about in terms of punk are DIY, or doing it together, a bit of make, do and mend, kind of making what you can out of what you've got, and often putting things together that don't normally go together. So I can kind of see that that's not such an impossible stretch, really.
I mean, if I could add to that as well, I mean, when Celeste and I first met, it was we were working on this book about the children of musicians and rock stars and how they're kind of perceived and the reality, and going into that bit. And I remember Celeste gave a wonderful interview and really talked about the sort of the Hare Krishna element and all that sort of, you know, that's very unconventional in itself, of course. But I remember also talking to Jazz Domino Holly, who's the daughter of Joe Strummer, and, you know, herself talking about sort of the punk influence, sort of it. They didn't give it that name, but, you know, it did seep in with sort of making stuff, or kind of having a different approach to things, or, you know, making sure you sort of had confidence and sort of felt empowered. And I really noticed that as well when I was working with the Slits over 10 years ago now on their biography. Their daughters, their children seemed to radiate a certain kind of confidence and inner power that I can only imagine must have come from having those amazing parents who'd fought a lot of the fights, kind of not fought them for those people, but kind of come through a lot, and then said, look, you know, you don't have to put up with this, or you don't have to listen to people when they do that. And they kind of radiate this this amazing confidence. So, and there was a sort of real awareness of the importance of what punk gave, not as necessarily even a music genre, but as an attitude and a spirit.
I think that's a really great way into it, is to think about maybe this is about attitudes and spirits rather than styles and sounds. And so are there things that you think you recognise in yourselves as being kind of that you've picked up from either working with the Slits or being around those women? Kind of what life lessons might punk have given you?
Well, I mean, yeah, definitely. I remember the Slits book was my first book, and I never thought I would go into writing books. My whole mission was, why have the Slits not got a book? Oh God, no one's doing it. I better write it. And I didn't think I had the skills to do that, but I just thought, in true punk DIY spirit, let's just get on with it and see where it takes us. But I definitely learned along the way. It definitely made me a lot more aware of feminism. I mean, they wouldn't have used that word, but that's, I think, what we would recognise that as, that feeling, that spirit, and that fight. And that sort of overcoming of things. And I was talking to the Slits and the Raincoats. I just found it very empowering in terms of my own music and my own creativity. It gave me a boost in confidence, which I'd sort of lost, and I really credit those people for kind of lighting a fire under me again, saying, look, it doesn't matter if you make mistakes, that what's a mistake anyway, maybe it's not a mistake. They just sort of changed my mindset, and it was very freeing.
I think that's really interesting, isn't it? And I really like the fact that it doesn't matter whether a group publicly identified as being feminist in 1976 or 78 or 82. What matters is the legacies and the symbols and the signs that we can pick up and do something with. And I think that's really exciting as well. Sorry, Celeste, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the influence, I think, of punk on me, I think it's grown, just in recent years. Obviously working with Zoe and working with Paul on the book and film projects, that's brought me very close to that world, and it's given me much more of an understanding of not just what my mum was trying to do, but all the other people involved in the movement and on the scene. And it's the women's stories, so we were super lucky to be able to interview people who were involved at the time. Very significant figures like Vivienne Goldman, who's also written a really key piece of work now, Revenge of the She-Punks, really comprehensive overview of this kind of this topic that we're talking about. So yeah, I think, I feel much closer to punk now actually than I did when I was a child. It meant very little to me then, and now I think I can actually conceptualize a little bit more what it means and the significance of it.
I think there's been a consolidation of kind of punk history in some ways, hasn't it, beyond the kind of coffee table books, and a very particular, slightly nostalgic narrative about a particular group of men or the Bromley contingent, or a particular shop, or we've got a much messier and more complicated history of punk now, which I think is really important. And I think maybe a starting point then is, Celeste, is to ask you, so how did you learn that history? How did you learn that history of punk? Where did you go to find out what was already out there and what needed to be done?
So the starting point was my mum's diary entries. Apart from the stories that my mother had told me about the period and sort of fragments of memories and things like that I received secondhand from her, really the starting point for me was her diary entries, these reflections on what she was doing at the time. And some of the reflections connect to some key places and people. So, for example, the Roxy Club and CBGBs and things like that. And that's kind of where Zoe and I started. We started with the diary entries, and then we had to expand upon that. Zoe already had a lot more knowledge than I did about punk music at that time, having worked on the Slits biography, and also being really, I think, connected to a lot of people through that journey that she had. So I learned a lot from Zoe, and then I think together, we had to do our research, and that involved you know, looking at old newspaper articles, interviews, you know, going online. My mother had a wealth of material, so part of her archive, so lots of newspaper clippings and things like that, old zines, and then the crucial element where I definitely say I learned the most was with the interviews. Yeah, so just interviewing people who were around at the time was, you know, the richest source of information, definitely.
I mean, there's something really punk rock just in that description of the different types of evidence that you're talking about, really. If we think about bricolage and montage, you know, the scraps of memory that you pick up, the personal diaries, the public representation in the media and the press, that feels like a really kind of punk rock methodology, I guess. So maybe the next thing to do is to think about, so tell us, what was the conversation that started this project then? How did you decide that this is what you were going to do together?
Well, Celeste contacted me. Yeah, we sort of kept in touch after the, you know, sort of just knowing each other and keeping in touch on Facebook. And Celeste sent me a message and said, you know, something to the effect of, I've got this amazing archive of material. It was my mum's, lots of visual stuff and stories. And there was a short story that she'd written and all these treasures that just no one had seen. And, you know, she said, you know, do you want to, we talk about, you know, I'd like to do a book and shall we have a chat? And so we met up and had a chat about this. And I felt very honoured that Celeste came to me with this amazing idea. And the more, you know, we chatted about it and Celeste told me about kind of what was in this collection. You know, we were saying, you know, Celeste said, you know, we want to kind of like look at the visual material and make it almost like an art book. Because the visual side was something that, you know, when people think of Poly Styrene, or maybe before the book and the film, they would think, okay, sort of punk queen, big voice, you know, braces, you know, all those sort of obvious Poly Styrene cliches, without wishing to do a terrible pun. But there were all these other sides to Poly that were maybe being forgotten or maybe not being acknowledged, like her role as a style icon and a pioneer of, I mean, you talk about bricolage and collage, which is very punk, very situationist. She kind of almost was a collage in her own right, with the way she put clothes together and sort of weird household objects became accessories and stuff. You know, that to me is the true spirit of punk, just like having fun with creativity. And so it was a real opportunity to put that forward, to put that side of her forward. And I think with the format of the book, which is one of my favourite formats to work in, kind of visual oral history, highly illustrated, you have such a lot of freedom to include as much as you can. You know, I suppose it all depends on print quality and all the rest of it, but, you know, as much of that wonderful material as we could went in, woven into conversations from the interviews that were conducted. And I think that kind of style of book really suited Poly. I'd worked in that style before with Wilko Johnson, who, although isn't similar when you think about it, is similar in some respects in that he's this multifaceted character who has so much more to him than people imagine. They see the kind of cartoon character version of Wilko. They don't know about his paintings, or they don't know about his, you know, the things that he's just collected that are so much a part of a person. It's like when you go into someone's house, you only really kind of get a full measure of their character when you see their record collection or their books. And it was an opportunity to show fans, you think you know Poly, but look at all this, you know, there was so much more to her. So that's sort of my take on it, but, you know, over to Celeste.
Yeah, that's exactly, you know, how the journey started. And I remember meeting Zoe at I think it was London Bridge Borough Market to have our first sort of big meeting. It was very exciting. And it just is one of these projects, you know, when something's supposed to happen, when something's meant to happen, it just all happens very easily and quickly. You know, things just moved really quickly. And, you know, before we knew it, we were making a film as well. So that it's quite incredible how it all happened. I mean, it seems quite a long time ago now, 5 years. It's almost 5 years since we met, isn't it? Because we met in 2016, the end of 2016. But yeah, I mean, just it was such a joy to work on this project together, and I really like working with other people. I have to say, I find I find it well, it's just much more enjoyable working, like when you're working on a project like this by yourself. I think it can get quite lonely, you know, and you'll end up spending a lot of time, you know, in a room by yourself hammering away. And whereas the way we did it, and also because of the format of the book being this kind of collage scrapbook, a lot of it involved actually just meeting up and, you know, doing practical things like photocopying and scanning, and, you know, that was a massive undertaking. And then of course the interview, so it was a sociable process, and that's for me why I really enjoyed it, because it was, you know, it involved not just Zoe and I, but it involved so many other people that we were able to connect with. And I feel like the book, what I like about the book, and this might not be to everyone's taste, some people might prefer a more straightforward biography, you know, the straightforward narrative, but I see the book as, on one hand, a piece of art in itself, and then on the other hand, it's a historical document. And the reason it's a historical document is because it's full of documentation, it's full of first-hand accounts. So I think if you could, you know, if you looked at the book as a piece, if you're a historian researching the era and researching my mother's life and researching her role in punk, I don't think you'll find a better resource, really, because it was so, you know, the level of research is really in depth. There's so much in-depth research, and yeah, the first-hand testimony of witnesses. It really kind of, I think it's the most factual you can get. The more voices you get in any kind of piece of writing, and the more perspectives, I think the clearer a picture you can get of what was really happening, because everyone has a different memory. Everyone has a different remembrance of the same thing. So yeah, it was just such a joy to work on, and I'm really proud of what we've done.
And I think there's two things that just really jump out at me in what you're saying is it's almost the impossibility of trying to trap someone like Poly Styrene in the written word alone, right? That how can you limit, you know, so we need the kind of aesthetic, we need the image to understand it, but also the clarity of complexity, right? That if we want to get to a moment, or if we want to get to a person, actually we don't need a simple line, we need all of the different views, all of the different understanding. I mean, it's one of the things actually that Johnny Watton does in his memoir, or his edit, is that he has people really disagreeing with each other right next to each other, which, you know, so you did the interviews, didn't you, Zoe? So let's talk about that process. Is that a process that you used is that how you normally have written your other biographies? How did you identify who you were going to interview? How did you approach them, and how did the interviews work?
That was the part of the process. Celeste, so cool. We will.
Oh, okay. I think Zoe's going to come back in. So Celeste, while Zoe comes back in, did you give Zoe people to interview, or did Zoe have her own list?
So Zoe and I, we did the interviews together, actually. So some of them we did next to each other in the same space, and others we divided up, and Paul did a couple as well. So yeah, we had an extensive list. That the first process was actually just contacting people and seeing if they would be willing to be interviewed. And we had some help with that. We had a production assistant, Morven, who worked on that, and that in itself is quite a job. And then we managed to sort of, you know, get our list of people who were willing to do it. The majority, I have to say. And then yeah, we had to schedule the interviews, and it was just based on who was available when, really. And obviously the best interviews and the most fun was when we were able to do them together, because I think, you know, it also gives a different, you get a different type of interview out of more of a group discussion, I think people can often open up a little bit more, because it's a bit less formal, whereas one-to-one, I think, can be, you know, I mean, obviously we're not those type of interviewers, but some people might feel a bit like they're interrogated, whereas, you know, the way we did the interviews, it was very conversational, just like having a chat. We did do it in a recording studio, and the reason was because we were using the audio interviews for the film, and so most of the interviews that you see in the film also are in the book, but actually they're much longer interviews in the book because we weren't restricted by time in the book.
I mean, that's a really lovely ecological way of using the interviews, isn't it? It's thinking we've got this evidence, let's use it in different ways. And I absolutely agree that I think the most exciting oral histories are those which are jointly composed or collaborative. It takes the pressure off people worrying about getting the right answer, which is something that often is a real stilt, or guessing what it is that people want. Oh, Zoe's back. Celeste and I have just been talking about the value of a more conversational interview. So having both of you there, and that, you know, in oral history methodology, we describe that as joint composure and valuing what happens in the room rather than seeing the interviewer's job is to go into the interviewee's head and extract a pure story. It's actually, we're trying to get to how people negotiate the world around them and their feelings. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were a few interviews for the book that I did on my own with people who maybe didn't want to be involved with the film, because we were sort of doing the two projects in tandem. So there were a few that were just sort of, or then there were a few that Celeste did on her own. I had some health problems, so I had to pull myself out. But as a result, it meant there was always someone on the case as well, and we were quite sort of well oiled by that stage in sort of what we wanted to know and include, but also give our interviewees the freedom to share things that we might not have even known to ask about. And that's the sort of the joy of this process, but also the joy of the format oral history. It liberates you, because if you're writing in a narrative style, which I enjoy writing in that style too, but there's only so many, you've got to kind of round things into a kind of a thing that feels a little bit more flowing and linear, whereas with oral history, yeah, you can have people disagreeing with each other next to each other. I love that. I find that really, really great. But also you don't have to be chronological. So for example, you can spend as much or as little time on certain points in someone's life as you want to. So for example, you know, I felt that like Oh Bondage Up Yours deserved a chapter of its own. That's just one song, but it's a really important song. But if you did that in a narrative flow, that would feel really like, wow, we spent a lot of pages on this and now not much on that, and it feels out of balance. So it allows you to kind of be much freer. And really, I think that's reflective of life, isn't it? You know, there are some things that leave a much deeper impression on us, and some things that just some days just fly away and we don't think about them. So it's a great format to work in, especially for a project like this, where, you know, as you say, you know, we all have different perspectives and memories of the same things happening. And that can be a tricky place to be as a biographer, because you're trying to give a balanced account, trying to be fair to everybody involved, and inevitably there's going to be something that goes in that you think sounds innocuous and someone says, you know, gets upset about, because they have a history and they know each other's agendas, and you're just trying to kind of pull together a story. So there's lots of complexities, but with oral history you kind of step back from it. I mean, Celeste is very is more involved in terms of, you know, there are, as you know, letters in the book, and there are, you know, sections which are written by Celeste in her voice as she's talking to her mum. But other than that, it is these conversations woven together, cut together, and I interviewed Celeste for the book as well, so that kind of is part of the conversation too, and it kind of rolls along. And the sort of the hope was that it would feel like when you open the book, you're sitting with all these people around you and you're just having a great conversation about Poly Styrene, you know. So I hope we achieved that.
And actually having a sense of not being restricted by chronology, but thinking about where's the emotional resonance lying, or where are the constellations coming together, where people are kind of amplifying particular moments. Celeste, I really want to ask you what it was like being interviewed by Zoe.
I mean, it was great. Obviously, Zoe had interviewed me previously, so you know, I knew it would be a great interview, and it was really important to do that. because yes, I was writing my own reflections, but the style was kind of quite poetic, and we really needed, you know, me to be interviewed as another additional voice there. So I'm also part of the let's say of the group of people at a party. Someone I read a review of the book, and they said they felt like, you know, they were you feel like you're at a party when you're reading the book, and everyone's all together in one space. So having Zoe interview me, so I'm also one of those voices, I think was really, really important.
And that was how we got
fairness of putting yourself into the same position. I mean, it's just such a fairness about it. I thought, sorry, Zoe.
No, it's fine. I was just going to say, just to add to that, it also meant that, you know, because sometimes when you're writing on your own, you've got certain things that you want to put across, but when you've got someone asking you questions that it kind of pricks a memory from before, that you think, oh God, yeah, of course, things about Celeste's grandmother and things about, you know, those sorts of stories. They you know, I mean, I've got so many favourite parts of the book, but I feel kind of an attachment to those stories that Celeste told me about her grandmother, and a bit more of the sort of family history that really kind of gives you a really interesting context. And it was only from sort of, I think we spent a few days doing interviews, Celeste, just together, and you can really go deep when you've got someone there sort of maybe prompting you or asking you questions because they weren't there, you know, or they didn't grow up with those stories around them that we take for granted, family stories. So getting those things down is great. And it reminded me of this quote, I think it was Billy Connolly says, he really doesn't like it when he hears people say, I came from nothing, or I come from nothing. He says, we all come from something. Whatever form it takes, we all come from something. We don't just appear hatched out of the egg, fully formed as us. You know, it's all feeding in. So those great stories about, you know, Polly's father, for example, or the things that little, you know, Polly, Marion, went through sort of growing up with her brother and sister, and things that just really surprised me and amazed me and were very moving, to be taken back to those places. So that was important.
I mean, it's an absolute gift when someone gives us their story, isn't it? I mean, I'm always really humbled when, you know, and I think that brings with it some a responsibility to honour those stories, doesn't it?
Huge.
So I'm going to think about a couple of things around ethics and editing. So one of the things that we have to do if we're going to do an oral history project is fill in a series of forms that actually think we're scientists working in a laboratory, and so expects everything to be anonymized and expects everything to be secret and stuff. And as an oral historian, I always have to say, well, actually it's not like that, because this person's working with me, collaborating with me. You know, I'm not working on their brain. So I wondered kind of how did you deal with the responsibility of carrying people's stories around? And particularly I was interested in, what do you do when people were talking about other people?
Well, I think, you know, this is something I go through every time I do a book, and I lose sleep over it and I worry about it. And I'm very, very conscious of exactly that huge responsibility, putting someone else's testimony forward, thinking about how they said things. Does that change the meaning? And I'm always, I mean, you know, I'm probably a bit over the top about this, but I'm always kind of, like when I was doing the Mary Chain book, I remember sort of someone saying something that sounded innocent at the time, and it actually probably was innocent. But I thought, if that other person that you're talking about affectionately reads that in cold hard print, will they take it another way, and will it upset them or upset their kids? Or, you know, you've got to think about this. Some things are just nobody else's business. It is, at the end of the day, just a music book. And although it's important to put people across in a true and authentic way, there are some stories which you think might be fun to include, but is that going to have a horrible effect on someone's life as a result of you including it, thinking, oh, that was a funny story? You know, it could be taken the wrong way. Maybe it's just not worth it. You have to think about those things all the time, because also when someone is, especially, you know, I won't sort of name names, but it's not a big dramatic thing, but some people might not be used to being interviewed. They might have never been interviewed before. So they might, you know, once, especially for a book, you spend a lot of time talking to people. They relax, then they open up, and then they might throw a few things in that they think, oh, you know, just in the flow of conversation, because they've relaxed and they forget it's not, I don't know, a therapy session or something like that, that certain things do come out, and you just have to be really sensitive, think, oh, just flag that, and then just privately afterwards, are you okay with us keeping that in? If not, it's no problem, but just we'd rather you told us now, because it's all very well getting people to sign a release form, but you know, we don't remember every single thing we say, do we? So I think you can't, you probably can go too over the top over it, but it is important. It's a really important point you raise.
I mean, in an academic oral history project, in a traditional project, we would give the transcripts back to the. I mean, it's really, which is very time consuming. Maybe you would only be doing a couple of interviews, but in its most traditional form, the transcript could then be re-edited. I mean, the difference with that is that, you know, you've got a book that's got a publication date, and I guess there's a point. So did you go? So that's interesting. So you did go back and check with people.
There weren't many occasions with this book I think we did that, but I'm just thinking there are times when I've definitely done that. But I think in this case, I think there was only one thing that I thought was going to end up in the film that I think was said to us, although it was part of the interview and it was recorded. I seemed to remember that the person who said it afterwards said, "Oh, I wish I hadn't said that," and I think then that got forgotten, and then it ended up, and I remember seeing one of the kind of early cuts and thinking, "Oh God," I remember him saying, "Maybe don't put that in." So you do have to think about those things, but that was the only thing I really remember from this book. But other than that, I just, you know, as I'm editing bits to put in, if I see something that I think, oh, that's not, you know, I might just kind of just let that go, as long as it doesn't spoil the kind of overall what's being said, you know, or ruin the meaning, because then you're getting into other territories that's a bit dodgy. But just being sensitive, I suppose, you know, it's so important, because there's no point in trying to celebrate a person because that's always the intention, isn't it? You want to celebrate this person, get people to appreciate that person, and then kind of, you know, ruin things for someone else in the process, you know, inadvertently.
Yeah, and do you think, Celeste, do you think that people responded differently in interviews because of your relationship with her? Do you think there was a sense that it was a kind of a commitment to you, or?
I guess, I mean, that must have had an impact, definitely. You know, perhaps people would have been kinder, you know, less critical, maybe if they'd ever had any beef with my mum in the past. Not that anyone really did, that everyone was actually very kind of, you know, just mainly positive memories. But yeah, of course it's going to have an impact because I'm her daughter. But then I think also it meant there was a kind of intimacy there. So, you know, people would often, you know, they would say in the interview, you know, your mum, your mum, your mum. And then we actually didn't want them to say your mum in the interview, because we didn't want to use that for the film, because we're using the audio for the film. So yeah, it was, I think it, in a way, it just it made the whole experience a lot more personal for the people that we were interviewing. But yeah, definitely it would have had an impact. I think also, if I remember, Paul Dean from X-Ray Specs, Zoe actually interviewed him alone, and then there was a second part of the interview where I was involved in the interview. I was interviewing him as well, and so, you know, I look back at the transcripts and I was quite interested to see if there was any difference, you know. And yeah, I don't know, Zoe, do you think there was some different, do you think we got something different out of Paul, like doing it just you and then doing it with me as well?
Oh my goodness, it's it's hard to remember actually, because when I was eventually working with the transcripts, I just sort of had them with me together. I couldn't remember which was which, but that's a really interesting point to look for the difference, because there was bound to be, I suppose. There's always going to be that slight level of, not caution, but, you know, an extra level of respect. But I think Paul was very honest, but he was very sensitive. As I recall, in both of our interviews, I didn't really see any kind of major things crop up. But I thought he was one of my favourite interviews actually for the book and the film. I don't know about you, Celeste.
Yeah, he was definitely one of my favourites, also because he was such a source, very rich source of first-hand knowledge and experience of X-Ray Specs. You know, we were so lucky to be able to interview Paul Dean and Laura Logic. So, you know, and they both had kind of different, you know, they weren't always saying the same things, they had different memories, different interpretations. So that was just really it added this real richness, definitely, to the story. And what was quite remarkable about Paul is how honest, and Laura too, how honest and open they were, you know, just honest and open, and willing to go there, you know, not being afraid to say it how it was, really tell it how it was. So I think that's that was great. And I don't think, I looked back at the transcripts trying to see if there was any difference in that case, and not really. So I don't think that people were kind of self-censoring when I was interviewing them. I hope not, anyway.
I mean, I was also thinking about the level of trust, I suppose, isn't it? That people can, you know, they've already, you know, people are aware of Zoe's work. They can see how respectful she is with people's voices and lives. You've got a very clear relationship and vested interest in doing a really good job. So I think it's sometimes all history projects involve a lot of building up of trust, whereas you kind of come with that currency, I guess. One thing I'd really like to think about is the relationship between the book and the film and how they came about. So originally, the book was imagined as a book, and then the film came later, and then they sort of, their tendrils entwine, and you have the same interviews being used in different ways in the two objects. What's the difference between the book and the film? What was the difference between making a documentary and making a biography, I guess?
I think it was, you know, very different. It's a very different process, but really complementary ultimately. And I think working on the book prior to the film was, I think, you know, an essential reason, a really huge reason why I think the film is so good, if I say so myself. And I think it adds this richness, and a lot of that is because the book makes an appearance in the film, and it is kind of, and the book is participating, you know, the book itself is like another character, but also, you know, we had the time with the book and the freedom to really research, you know, to really to have extensive interviews and all things that needed to eventually be cut down for the film, because you have these time constraints. But having done all the work already on the book really meant that in many ways constructing the film later was all that much more easier. And I mean, it wasn't easy, but definitely it was a huge help. And, you know, without the book there wouldn't be a film. It's as simple as that.
But it came out of the conversation with after talking to Celeste in those early, you know, 5 years ago. I remember talking to Paul, who I'd sort of worked with on other things, and he was just saying, you know, should we do a film together? What do you fancy doing? You know, got any ideas? And I thought, well, Celeste has just been in touch and she's got this incredible archive, and what an amazing story. Why is there no film about Poly already? So I was like, what do you think? And he was obviously up for it, and so was Celeste. But so my memory of it is that they kind of did work in tandem. Obviously we were all doing different jobs within that, and eventually I sort of went more towards the book side and kind of constructing that together, you know, the sort of nuts and bolts of it. And Celeste was, you know, became co-director of the film with Paul. And so the two things sort of were, you know, obviously the book came out first because ultimately it's you know, making a film incredibly complex and takes an incredibly long time for all sorts of myriad reasons. Whereas once you've got all the materials for a book, it's just down to you getting it together and doing it, you know. So it's simpler in that respect, for constructing it. So in a way it was good as well, because it kept the momentum up of this Poly Styrene fever, this excitement, you know, because we'd had our crowdfunder for the film, and then, you know, we're beavering away on the book, and then of course the film took a bit longer than we thought, but then the book came out, so it all sort of kept that momentum going, and one is sort of a companion to the other. And a lovely thing, you know, Celeste said, you know, there's only so much you can include in a film because you've got time constraints, whereas with a book, I mean, I couldn't include everything in terms of, you know, it was not just like long transcripts, you know, you do have to still be quite kind of judicious in what you choose. But at the same time, I knew this isn't just going to be a load of repeats. You know, people aren't going to see the film and then read the book and think, well, I've heard all this. It's the same conversation. It's not, you know, there's so much more we could include, and as I say, there are people in the book who aren't in the film, and you know, so they are companions, they're sisters but not twins, I would say. Like eyebrows.
Yeah. And what is remarkable is how many people have watched the film and then gone and bought the book, and then been very complimentary about the book. So it's you know, they are companion pieces, but yeah, if you've watched the film, there's still so much to discover in the book. You're not going to be bored reading the book. You're not going to think, oh, I've seen this already, seen it all in the film. Not at all. So it's great, and it's worked the other way as well. Of course, people who've read the book have gone to seek out the film. So you know, I think that's quite rare, isn't it? Usually people who have read a book and they love a book, they generally hate the film, don't they? And that's been my experience. So luckily we haven't had that at all. It's just, you know, people have really enjoyed both formats, so that's great.
And I also think they've kind of they've infected each other a little bit, haven't they? I mean, because it's such a visual book, and it's actually a very texty documentary in a lot of ways in terms of the use of words. So it's another piece of kind of bricolage in some ways, isn't it, around what the form of a biography can be and what the form of a documentary is expected to be. So how did the collaboration on the film work? So you talk really nicely about the kind of practicalities of you and Zoe photocopying things together and you two interviewing things together. Does the collaboration work differently in the terms of the documentary?
Yeah, definitely, mainly because there are so many more people involved. You know, with the book, it was Zoe and I, and obviously the people that we interviewed. And with the film, you know, we had a team of, you know, let's say 7-8 people, or if we include everyone who helped us along the way. So yes, the film, it was as much a collaborative effort as the book, but even more so because we had this sort of bigger team, and it really does take a village, you know, to make a film. There are directors who I have enormous respect for, who are able to do everything, you know, like they shoot the film, they edit, they do they write, they produce, but yeah, I mean, none of us had that sort of I don't think any of us went into it wanted to work in that way, you know, so everyone had their part to play, and equally important parts to play in making the film what it was, you know. So it was very much a team effort.
I mean, I should add to that as well with the book. Ultimately, we had the designer Laura Finley, and we had our editor Imogen Omnibus, wonderful people, and you know, just made it really special. But I suppose the difference as well is that when you're working on a book, you got to have it pretty much, you know, as in a shape that you want it to be before you've even handed it to anybody. So, you know, you get it into, you know, you get it as you're, you know, in a way that you're happy with. And I'd sort of made folders and files as to, you know, this picture could go here with this bit, this picture could go with there with that bit. But you've got to have all that kind of together before you've even handed it in. So it's much more kind of, you know, there's a period where you are sort of on your own with it, and then you hand it over, and then the next stage begins. So it's quite different in that respect. And of course, you know, all the madcap ideas I had for what could go where, not all of those were accepted, because of course you've got to think about print quality and how things fit together in terms of just layout. So you can't always have everything you want, but that in itself takes a long time. And once you've got the kind of bits and pieces together, you know, when you're doing that, you know, you can't have millions of people involved with that, because otherwise you just never get it. It would never happen. You would never get it done. So you've got to get it sort of happy with it, then it gets handed over, then it goes through the editing process. So it's much more, I suppose, a more straightforward process than it is with a film, where things are out of sequence, or you're kind of having, you know, I remember at the beginning of the process, sort of meetings about what might happen at the end, when you know, I'm writing, you know, I think about things, you know, I'm pretty scattergun, but generally speaking, you know, I tend to sort of think about things in a certain sequence, and it's so different with a film. And I really admire the mindset is so different. To me, I kind of was just in awe of how everyone brought it all together. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it's a totally different process, isn't it?
Yeah.
I want to think you're touching a little bit on how people receive them together, and I think that's also really interesting. People reading and viewing together in a kind of joined up way. And I wondered if you thought, sort of, in terms of making Poly's history stick, kind of what how different do you think Poly's history looks now, the other side of the film and the book? Do you think which kind of ideas have people changed around her? Or do you think that they've understood about her differently? I mean, for me, definitely having a much better understanding of her roots, where she comes from and what she goes on to do, for me makes sense of that little moment that I was already really obsessively familiar with as a young woman. That was a really important part for me, actually, is thinking about life. This is a moment of life cycle stage when there's something before and there's other things to come. I wondered what other people's reactions had been, how their version of Polly might be different now.
So I've had the good fortune to be in touch with many people who watched the film and read the book. They'll often reach out on social media, and we have our film Instagram, for example, so we get some messages, and Facebook as well, and that's really, I love that, actually, hearing from people and getting their feedback. And what I would say is that I think most people, when they say what they liked about both the book and the film, is this deeper understanding of my mum's story. So yeah, I mean, people have, the X-ray specs period is what most people were already kind of familiar with to an extent, but generally just the music itself. And obviously that is an important part of the book and the film, but it's not the most important part. Yeah, so it's her early years, her childhood, and, as you said, what she goes on to do, and especially in terms of her spirituality. I think these are really, really, really important elements of both the book and the film. So I think the response to that has been overwhelmingly positive, because I think often you may be a fan of someone because you enjoy their music, but the idea that you have is an idea of them as people, is an idea that's been constructed, usually constructed by the media, but often it's also self-constructed, so the artists, they do tend to, my mother was no exception, tend to sort of create their own mythologies, as it were. So I think this very personal story that we were telling, and obviously my role in that as her daughter, I think it gave people an understanding of who she was as a real person, and that's been the overall, the large part of the feedback I've received has been along those lines.
And that definitely challenges some of that. It's the punk canon, which was pretty stuck in aspic, and it was very male and a bit obsessed with authenticity and focusing on a very particular moment in time. And actually, I've always found that really uncomfortable. And the idea that, so you were punk in '76 so that you can continue talking about this for the rest of your life and telling every other young person that they're being a young person wrong. That's what it was all about, was it? And so actually recognizing the importance of some of those ideas that might have crystallized in those moments, but come out in terms of thinking about spirituality, thinking in different ways, is really important. And there's a lot of really interesting work around punk spirituality at the moment, and the role of spirituality within all sorts of subcultural practice that's often been ignored because it's often gendered, I suppose. So did you have anything to add about how you think kind of the whole entity of Poly looks different because we're moving, the book and the film have helped us move beyond one element of her?
Definitely. And I think, the timing is, I don't believe in coincidences, and I'm sure Poly, and I know Laura Logic doesn't believe in coincidences, but I think the timing is really interesting, that it came out when it came out, in this era where we are improving how we discuss things like mental health and things like gender and race and all these things. It was just sort of lucky timing, because in a way, I'm sure people have always been talking about this, but people haven't always been listening very well or understanding. Whereas now we're getting better. We've got a long way to go, but we are getting better at having those conversations. And this book fits within that, I think people are ready to hear those stories, those difficult stories. You know, that they were hard to, it was often quite an upsetting story to work with, but you know, I thought everyone was very honest and kind, but honest about certain things, like for example, you know, there's this whole myth about the kind of punk sisterhood and how everyone's kind of in it together. That, you know, that is a myth. Unfortunately, I think the sisterhood in some respects still is a bit of a myth. I think we too easily throw each other under the bus, because there's this unconscious perhaps feeling that there just isn't enough room for more than one interesting woman in the room, or more than one woman in the band, to, you know, to reference X-Ray Specs. And so there is this, you know, one of the stories that people talk to me about when they've read the book is, you know, wow, you know, this story when, you know, Laura Logic, the saxophonist in X-Ray Specs, and a dear friend of Polly's at that time, was sacked. She was sacked because there was a review that really bigged up Laura and her presence and her charisma and how stylish she was and how she's really the star of the band, which is a very insidious thing to say in itself. And, you know, why do we have to pit women against each other anyway? Why does it have to be a competition? But Polly, you know, a sensitive soul, you know, she obviously had her insecurities, and she was young, and, you know, don't we all have our neuroses and insecurities in different ways? And I think it sort of stoked a feeling of insecurity and instability and jealousy, and you know, Laura was gone. And I think the fact that we shared that story, and Laura was very you know, very honest about it in a very generous way, but she was very honest about how it broke her heart. And you know, a lot of people, I think, like to think that all women in music are all in it together and we're all kind of like, this is camaraderie. It's not really true, sadly. In some cases it is, and that's fantastic, but there's still too many examples of women who intrinsically feel there's just not enough space. And it makes me think of a book that recently came out by Tracy Thorn, who I know you mentioned earlier, Lucy. This wonderful book called My Rock and Roll Friend, which is such an unusual book because Tracy has written a biography of another famous woman in music, Lindy Morrison from the Go-Betweens, who is a drummer, amazing, incredible character. And I thought, wow, this is a beautiful, generous thing. We've got another, you know, amazing woman, and she's written the biography of this amazing woman, and it's also about their friendship, and they were very close over the years. So there's that feeds in as well. But we don't have to. I think it's important that we write our voices in, as you say, and that we speak up for ourselves, and we don't allow women's stories to be diminished, but we have to do it for each other as well as ourselves. Otherwise there will never be enough room. We have to make the room, we have to create the space. If we have to smash stuff up to do it, then so be it, you know, but we have to do that, otherwise it will never change, and it will always be your token woman on the quiz show, or, you know, only one woman in the band because, you know, it's a gimmick. We've not moved far on enough from that mindset, in my opinion. So I thought that was an interesting book to reference, because I thought that's so unusual, but how fantastic. And we should see more of that. You know, women, don't pull the ladder up behind you, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely, but also, I mean, I guess it's another thing to think about in terms of memoir, is thinking about one of the dangers with memoir or biography is it sets up the individual as the exception. Yeah. And how do we generalize around those exceptional women? I mean, the other book in terms of sisterhood in punk that I often think about is the book by Nancy Spungen Mother, which is an incredibly difficult read about the ways in which Nancy Spungen has been constructed within punk narrative. It's really, really difficult read, but you know, that kind of, we as individual women, we can't actually unpick all of patriarchy in one go. I guess that's the lesson, isn't it? And some of it we have to carry around with us. I'm going to ask you to talk about what's happening next, and use that question, and you talk about that, for anyone who wants to write anything in the Q&A, to do that now. If you have anything, any thoughts, any ways, any other women that we should be amplifying, what do we do about patriarchy? That would be quite a nice one if anyone's got any answers to that. And or your responses to the film and the book. But so Celeste, this also has another layer, which I guess grows out of the archival holdings that you've got, the personal papers and the estate, that is going to be a touring exhibition. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about That sounds like just a fascinating journey from a text into a film and into this exhibition.
Yeah, so we had the first exhibition a couple of years ago, and the intention has been to tour the exhibition. Sadly, the pandemic happened in the middle of that plan, so yeah, it's kind of been put on the back burner. But I hope to resume, and hopefully this sort of the end of this year we'll have another exhibition in the US in LA. Hopefully, I mean, we can't get from the UK to the US yet, so let's see how that's going to happen. But yeah, for me the exhibition is like the final piece of the puzzle, because it's a companion piece. It's part of the wider project. So I think if you love the book and you love the film, then this is an opportunity with the exhibition to actually get really close to the material that you see that from the archive. And there's a lot more, there's a lot more that we weren't able to fit into the book, or we weren't able to show in the film. So it's kind of just, an extension of everything that we've kind of worked on. And it's always a nice opportunity also to revisit the book, we did some events around, book events around the exhibition as well. And, more Q&As, more discussions, film screenings. So it's just kind of another nice way to bring it all together, and bring the team together as well.
And another really interesting way to explore how do we tell the stories around an individual through the traces that they've left for us, the experiences that other people have had around them, and that stuff around how they're being represented. And I think there's something really interesting in the different forms that you're moving those different things through. Zoe, what are you doing next?
Well, what am I doing next? Well, I am working on I've got a book coming out next year, which is, well, I was going to say it's quite different, but maybe it's not really. It's called Witchful Thinking, and it's all about the kind of the wise woman or the cunning woman, and how we can use that archetype in today, modern life, and it's a kind of sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek kind of, no, that's the wrong word, warm and witty handbook for the modern wise woman, but it does contain a lot of sort of personal stories and just there's a little bit about patriarchy smashing in there as well. So
yeah, I've been really, really blown away by the amount of beautiful witchery that a lot of young women are utilising to make their lives better at the moment. It's really exciting. Do you think that there are things that you've learned from working together, working between these different types of evidence, weaving together these different stories, and the way in which you two have worked together, that is going to change how you work in the future? Are there things that you think, I'm definitely taking that with me as a way of working?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I loved working with Celeste, and it's such a rare treat to work with someone else. I mean, as I say, there's only one other time that I've done that in this, and that was with Wilco Johnson. But again, it was, he kind of, with the visual material, he sort of left me to it and said, look, there's loads of shoe boxes there, there's stuff in there you can use, I don't know, and just left me to it. Whereas with Celeste, obviously, we worked together on that, really, and so that was really lovely, because as you say, it's quite lonely writing books, isn't it, when you kind of get down to it. So that was a lovely thing, but it has got to be the right material, and it generally has to sort of be around a kind of visual archive to sort of drive that forward. But it was a great experience, definitely.
Well, I think it's just the way you both describe it, there's just such a perfect fit between how you worked and the story you're working on and the evidence that you're working with. And it's like alchemy, that moment when you find the right process, I think. What about you, Celeste? Are there lessons that I know that your next project is sort of different. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Gorbachev and the Krishna Kids project?
Yeah, I mean, it's in very, very early stage of development, and so it's just really in the researching still stage. and just beginning to think about what this might look like. Also deciding whether this will be a book and a film again, or just a film. I'm sort of leaning towards just a film at the moment. And yeah, I've just worked on starting on the treatment stage really, so it's very, very early, and at the moment it's just me, and I obviously want to, you know, I will need to collaborate again with, you know, with a team. And so everything I've learned from working with Zoe and working on the film with Paul, you know, it's all going to be hugely valuable experience. And I hope we can all, you know, well, I mean, we are all sort of working together. You know, we're doing events like this, doing talks. I mean, I see us doing these talks for a long time, Zoe. So I hope you don't get fed up.
Never.
Fed up with
It's a pleasure.
I guess that was a really lovely part, having the book and the film having this afterlife afterwards.
Yeah.
That I guess when you're hitting publishing deadlines, which I really feel with you, Zoe, about having to get it ready to hand it in, you kind of forget about the afterlife. Yeah. So have there been any surprises in terms of what the film or the book have done or have let you do, or where they've gone, or how they've been responded to?
Gosh, I don't know. I suppose there must have been. I guess it's always interesting to see who responds to what, because you've got this very multifaceted story and this very multifaceted person, and there are so many different elements to it. It's not just a music story. It's not just a fashion story. It's lots and lots of, and you know, lots of very deep and personal things as well. So you never know what's going to resonate with who, and so I find that quite interesting, and you know, it's all, you know, beautiful to sort of just hear what pops out to different people really. But I think you know, talking to a lot of you know, hearing a lot of the women's stories for the book, and obviously that echoes a lot of the stories I was sort of familiar with maybe from doing the Slits book, is this sense of self-esteem perhaps, and how we need to, as women artists or just as women, work on that a bit. I think we've got used to feeling a low self-esteem that we might not even know we have. So we're kind of not used to the idea, perhaps we're getting better now, but not used to the idea of maybe pushing our stories forward. We're used to having our voices diminished, or maybe even ridiculed, or just completely erased. And when I first spoke to Viv Albertine and contacted her for the Slits book all those years ago, and this was before really there was an awful lot of punk women memoirs out there, I remember her first thing was, she said, well, is anyone going to be interested? And you know, we can't imagine that now, because everyone's really lit up by the Slit story, and rightly so, and all the kind of associated people connected with that, and people like Vice Versa, we're hearing about those sorts of stories. And you know, Punk Girl Diaries do an amazing job of sharing women's stories. I love them. Helen McCookery book with the Lost Women in Rock. There are people out there pushing those stories forward for other women, which is wonderful. But we need to kind of have the self-esteem to also kind of, you know that yes, my story is valid, and you know, yes, it's as interesting as Joe Strummer's, or you know, I think that's important. And that really it reminded me, I suppose, that feeling of, you know, you are allowed to tell your story and value it and know that it's worth something.
I think what's really important about that is recognising that it's not that women haven't spoken, it is that they've been silenced or ignored. It's not that we've all been sitting around not thinking interesting things, it's that we've all been told to shut up at some point. And that's my really interest in trying to get histories to stick. You know, so like, and I think what you've, because of the way in which you've worked in the different ways that the histories are being presented, it's like, you can't ignore this, it has to stick, doesn't it? Celeste, I'm going to pass over the final words to you, if there's anything that you want to say, either in terms of the surprising life that the book and the film have had, or in terms of just kind of broader reflections on what the whole process has been like. I did really want to acknowledge just how perfect a COVID discussion that it's been, particularly around mental health and resilience, and kind of and the inward power that we need to draw on. I think it's been a really a profound fit, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, also I think what's interesting is that the book came out just before COVID and this pandemic, and also the film, the last year of making the film was during the pandemic, and it is quite fitting if we think about some of the themes that my mother was exploring in her writing. And that's one of the, I think, again, it's something that really strikes people, is how prescient she was in terms of her imaginings of the future. And we are very much living in that future, you know. So this period, this current period, is the germ-free adolescence chapter, and obviously identity and themes, you know, another very important theme and current hot topic, you know, that is being really, really explored and delved into at the moment. And you know, every song that she wrote on that album, it's like we're living that moment. So I think that's quite, you know, there's something quite it's quite spooky, let's say, when you're actually in the middle of that. And I feel like a lot of people, that is resonating with the audience and with readers. They're just like, you know, they're kind of stunned by how much of a seer she was. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the kind of environmentalism and the eco-politics and the gendered nature of that, just staggering, really. Thank you so much, both of you. Zoe's also going to be joining us at some point towards the end of the month, I think, maybe on the Intellectuals Unite Book Club, which is on Instagram at Prof L Robinson, and we're doing Steppenwolf, which we already started talking about with Jemima Jury actually at the beginning of the week. So that's a really nice thing that we'll be doing next. And I think we'll also be picking up this conversation in a few other virtual spaces, Celeste. The book and the film continue to have an afterlife, and I really, really look forward to the exhibition as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're not even in the same place, so it's really lucky that we could do it. And thanks everyone for coming along, and we'll pick up this conversation somewhere else again, I'm sure. But thanks a lot, and thanks to Adam, Jessica, and Emma and the team. You've been amazing.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.